Alright, in this video we're going to continue with JavaScript arrays. We learned about push and pop, which operate at the end of a JavaScript array. Push adds an item, and pop removes an item. So pop is a shorter name, so it makes the array shorter. Push is a longer name, so it makes the array longer. That's how I remember it. Similarly, we learned about shift and unshift. They operate at the beginning of an array. So shift is the shorter name, so it makes the array shorter. Unshift is the longer name, so it makes the array longer. All right, so let's start with this array. It's a simple array: apples, bananas, cranberries, dragon fruits. Then we use fruits.concat, right? So we're concatenating items to the original list. It makes a new list, right? And we're going to pass in this list of items. And also we see that you can pass in an additional item that's not in an array if you would like. And you can do any number of these with the concat method. All right. So this is just an array of several items. There's 8 items here, right? So we can see that we can pop items off. Console.log. And first let's just look at what we have. Fruits. And I'll make fruits 2. Now I'm going to make a duplicate list. Okay, so with the slice function that returns a new list. Sorry, that's not right. Slice, you pass in the index of the slices, right? So fruits has 8 items. If I don't pass in anything, it effectively just makes a copy of the array. So fruits is an array with 8 items. This makes a copy, right? But it's not the exact same array. It's a separate array. They just happen to store the same items. Okay, so we can look at this fruits, and don't forget to declare my variable and console.log. There we go, fruits 2. All right, so we can run this with node, and this is array index pop. Okay, so these are our 2 arrays, fruits and fruits 2. And what I can do with fruits is pop items off. So console.log, and if I pop an item off, fruits.pop, it always pops from the end. I can pop a few items off, console.log, and print out fruits. Not only does it remove the item from our original list of fruits, but pop returns that item as well, so that we're going to see that log out to the menu. If we stored it in a variable, we could do that as well and do something interesting with it if we wanted. All right, so we already learned about pop, right? And we see we pop off these items, and again, it's operating from the end of the list, right? So honeydew was the last item in the list. We popped it off. Then grapefruit, we popped it off. And then figs, we popped it off. And then this is what's left. Okay, so we have 5 items left because these have been removed. So what we're going to try to do is mimic this behavior on our own. We're going to make our own pop function, but we're actually going to add some functionality. We're going to make it use negative indexes. So sort of like the slice method does, right? So that's handy. So not only will pop be able to remove an item from a list at the end, right? You could optionally specify an index. So I could specify, say, pop 3, for example, and that would return the item at index 3 and remove it from the list. Okay, so this is going to be sort of a higher functioning version of pop. And this is similar to how Python pop works, right? So if you're familiar with Python and frustrated sometimes the JavaScript pop doesn't work the same way, you can make your own version here. Okay, so console.log. Okay, this is the next section here. So we're going to say we still have, let's put fruits back to where it was. So fruits equals fruits2.slice. Okay, so fruits is now back to the full 8 item list. And we want to define a function called array pop. All right, and we want you to provide the user, the caller of this function, to provide an index. Okay, and that index is going to be the item that we take off. All right, so how can we do this? Well, we're going to have to know how to modify a list, first of all. We need to know how to, the universal function in JavaScript to modify a list, adding or removing or anything, is the splice function. So that's what we're going to have to use. And we can say we want to start at this index. So the result. So with splice, it's always, these are the removed items. Okay, so with splice, we've already talked about that in a previous video, but I'll explain it quickly again. You take the array, so that's got to be our first argument, and then we want to provide an index. Okay, so we want to look on this array and call splice, and we want to start at a particular index. That's the first argument. So we're going to use whatever index the user, whatever argument they provide that's stored in this parameter. And then the next item is the number of items to remove. So with pop, you only ever remove one item. So that's what we want to remove. And with splice, you can optionally add more items, but we don't want to add anything. Okay, so this is effectively going to do what we want. Splice, you start at a particular index, you remove one item, and this is going to be a list of all the items that you removed, because theoretically we could remove 4 items or however many items we want. In this case, we only want to remove one item, right? But we don't want to return a list, we want to return just that individual item. So we will return removed items in the item at index 0. Okay, so let's see if we can mimic this functionality that we want to see here. So console.log, we're going to log out fruits, and then we'll say console.log array pop, and we're going to pass in our array fruits, and then we'll mimic this functionality here, right? So when you pop an item off of the end of the list, what's the index that you're passing in there? Well, the highest index of a list is always one less than its length. Right? Just as an example here, if I have no items in the list, the length of this list is 0. So the highest index, there is no valid index here, right? If I have one item in the list, the length of this list is 1, so the highest index in this list is the length minus 1. So 1 minus 1 is 0. That's the highest index, right? If I have 2 items, the length of the list is 2. The highest index is the length minus 1. So that's index 1, length 2 minus 1, right? Length minus 1 is the highest index, so 3 minus 1, index 2, right? So that's what we want to pass in here. So this is going to be fruits.length minus 1. All right? And if we pop this a couple times, pop all this stuff off, and then print out fruits, essentially we should be doing everything we did up here. Right? We had fruits. We don't need to print out fruits too. We've got fruits, and we pop 3 items, and then print fruits again. And that's what we're doing here. Fruits. Pop off 3 items at the end, and log fruits. All right, exact same scenario. Right, so we've mimicked the behavior, except it's not as good, right? Because we didn't have to specify an index. So we need to optionally allow them to not specify an index. Right? We have more functionality, but also less, right? Because they have to specify an index here. If I don't specify something, like if let's do this. Right? So I didn't specify an index. There we go. There we go. And so it messed everything up because the splice function took off apples instead. All right. So if the index you provide is undefined, it's going to start at the beginning. Right? And so that's just sort of weird behavior. We wouldn't necessarily expect it. JavaScript does that a lot, and sometimes that can be the cause of bugs. So it's really important that you understand how these functions work in JavaScript. Right? You probably wouldn't expect that to happen. If index, what we passed in here, if that was undefined, right, which it is because we're not passing anything in, if you provide undefined here as the first item, it will start taking things off the beginning. Right? That just seems unusual, but that's the way it works. So, knowing that, we want to have some sort of default where if they don't provide anything here, then by default we'll make it the length of the array, -1. Okay? So if index is undefined, and just to prove that this is the case, console.log So we should see this be undefined when at this function call. Undefined. So we see that it is undefined. So if it's undefined, we want to say that index by default should equal the array length -1. Okay, and now we're back to it working as expected. So that means we can remove, we don't have to provide it, the index if we don't want to. So that's nice. That makes this much nicer to use. I don't have to provide that index. Okay, but what's nicer about our function than the original function is we can specify a particular index. So if I wanted to pop, say, if I wanted to pop the first item, right? I want to pop off the item at index 0. I want to pop off the item at index 3. Okay? Let's see what this looks like. So I wanted to pop off the item at index 0, apples, right? And then the item at index 3. Remember, apples is gone at this point. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. We remove that item, right? And then we can pop off the end. And here's what we're left with. Bananas, cranberries, dragon fruits. Bananas, cranberries, dragon fruits. We removed elderberries and figs and grapefruit. Okay? So now our function has more functionality than the original pop function. Right? And then there's probably one more thing that we can do that will make this really nice is if we allow for negative indexing. Okay, so let's test that. If I pass in -1 here, right? So the index is -1. So let's see what array.splice does with that. Let's see if that's allowed. Okay, so this last item is honeydew, but that's what it was anyway. So let's do -2 and see if it changes anything. And so, sure enough, negative indexing works with Splice. Okay? Now, if it didn't work with Splice, we could still make it work. Right? What's happening behind the scenes? How does Splice know what a negative index means? Well, the -1 index is really just the same as saying the length of the array -1. So a -2 index is just the length of the array -2. Right? -3 index is the length of the array -3. So if we just add the length of the array, if the index is negative, then that would take us to the right index, but it would be positive. Right? So that's all that's happening. It's just sort of a nice shortcut. But see, now our function array pop works with lots of different index values. Right? We can pop off items by index value. Right? And there's our negative index. Okay, so we added functionality and we made we mimicked the behavior of pop, right? But then we added functionality, and part of that is mimicking the idea of like being able to pass in an argument or not. So it's sort of not nice to not have to pass in an argument, right? And so, you know, we could do that here with something like that. Right? We don't want to pass in. If we don't pass in anything, then there's a default, right? It saves us typing and it makes the code a little bit cleaner. All right? So that's an example of array index mimicking the pop functionality for arrays. Now, where this can be especially useful is combining this with the index of function. Right? So if I wanted to remove all of the items or pop an item off. Let me remove an item from the list that's matches elderberry, right? So I could say index of fruits2 dot index of, and I want to search for elderberry, and then I can say if I is greater than or equal to 0, right? So if it's -1, that means it wasn't found. So if it's not -1, I could also just say does not equal -1, then that means we found an index, right? And then I can say I wanted to remove it, right? Well, now I can use my array pop and remove by index, right? So I can say array pop, what's the array, fruits2, and what's the index, I. Right, and then this would remove it. Console.log fruits2. Okay, so using these functions in conjunction with each other is an important skill. Not only mimicking them, but using them together. So let's see if we can run that again. Right, and sure enough, the item at index I, console.log, oh, elderberries, there we go, console.log I. Okay, so it found elderberries, right, at index 4, and then it removed it. So remember, we're using fruits2 here. Console.log. All right, print out fruits2, find elderberries if it's there, pop it off. So we could make a function around this, and I'll leave this for you, but make a function to remove an item. So if you pass in that item name, it'll remove it from the list. All right, so that's a good exercise. All right, so elderberries is in there. It's at index 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pop it off, and now we see it's gone in the resulting list. All right, so that's pretty extensive coverage of arrays and the different things you can do with the arrays. So hopefully you learned something from that. That should do it for this video.